Welcome to Redefining Engagement. I'm Francesca, Director of Audience Development and Strategy at Contribly. And in this show, I speak to leaders and innovators in the media industry so that we can bring tips, wisdom, ideas, and even some things to avoid so that we can all do more engagement better. So without further ado, let's move on to our next guest. Hi, Nic. Lovely to have you on. How are you?
Very well. Glad to be doing this on a sunny New York City morning.
Lovely. Sunny here in the UK as well. So we've got that in common. Well, how about we start off with a little introduction? Would you mind introducing yourself? Tell us a bit about your background and where you're working at the moment.
Yeah, my name is Nic Dawes. I'm the executive director, effectively the publisher of The City. We're a local newsroom serving the people of New York City, a nonprofit. We have about 30 staff and we cover classical, big city metro issues through an investigative lens and through service journalism that aims to empower people and help them get things done in this complicated place. And I've been a journalist and a news executive in South Africa and in India. I've also done some human rights work. And so this job kind of pulls together all of those experiences into an attempt to find a new way to rebuild local news capacity in one of the greatest news cities in the world.
And I have a passion for local, so I'm quite excited to hear your takes on engagement. And you also mentioned service journalism, which I think is a great opportunity to actually engage directly as well. How about we start with what you define as audience engagement?
Yeah, so we're a public interest news outlet and a nonprofit. Everything we do to build engagement serves public interest needs. And we don't think of engagement as starting with building raw audience numbers, for example. We really think about the ways in which it supports our mission. Of course, that can mean a pretty wide range of things, but for us, it's really all of the ways in which we bring the people whom our journalism serves into the process of making and distributing our work. So that sounds broad, but everything we do to listen to New Yorkers, understand what their concerns are, give them an opportunity to interact with our journalism while it's in the process of being made, also to create feedback loops with them once it is made, to iterate what we do next, and hopefully ensure that more people see it and interact with it. And ultimately to build both direct one-to-one relationships with the people whom we serve and to create more of a network and a community around what we do, both from an impact and a mission perspective and from a revenue building, membership, philanthropic support perspective.
How you have the mission as like the number one thing and that it's a super active form of engagement versus maybe just looking at metrics of how much time people are spending on page. Has your definition of engagement changed? Is this a new version or have you always seen it this way?
I think it has sharpened maybe more than it's changed. And what I would say is you mentioned that we don't just look at metrics. And, there's something about the term audience engagement, which can lead you to frame the work as essentially advertising metric terms. What are we doing to drive page views? What are we doing to drive basic interactions, social media type engagement metrics or algorithmic engagement metrics? For us, that all matters, of course, because we, even as a very mission-driven organization, what the top of our funnel looks like is important and how we move people through it is still important. But really at the core, what we've zeroed in on is what we value most in audience engagement is how can we build a relationship with you as an individual and how can we show up in your community in a way that includes those individual relationships within a bit more of a matrix or a network of connectivity, and how can we build community around what we do. So we're much more focused on fewer higher quality interactions than we are on trying to solve the problem of engagement at scale.
I like that. Audience engagement as a term, the perception that we give to it is really interesting. I feel the same about UGC. I think the moment we say UGC, people think of social media. So that's why we've reframed it as CGC, which is community generated content, which takes away all of the preconceptions that we have in the industry. What do you think there's a different term that we should be using that isn't audience engagement? Have you got one?
I think there are lots of terms that float around in the orbit of audience engagement. So people talk about community engagement, which can mean something very different, right? The community that you engage with might or might not be your audience. There's community listening. You might want to convert the community into your audience if they aren't already, and you're engaging. There's community listening, which is really about hearing and understanding what people's needs are. Um, there's think there that you can start to think about collaborative journalism, or constructive journalism. And I'm not
Yeah.
sure that there's a single kind of portmanteau that completely works. The idea of the audience, and this goes back to our earlier discussion about metrics, the idea of the audience as a public, like the public whom we serve, or as a set of publics who constitute around what we do or engage with what we do, has a bit of a different valence or feeling than the idea of the audience that we've a little bit debased with a chart BT way of thinking about what audience is. So I don't know if I have a neat term, but I think some of these things around community, around listening, around collaboration are very useful to bring to bear in a context that's sometimes a little bit thin, and we deprive ourselves of the richness of the kind of interaction that we can have if we only think about it in these thinner terms.
I'm going to have to come up with a great term for this, aren't I? Looking at your audience engagement, I'm going to use that term for now.
Let's.
As a whole, yes, let's. It's just so much easier for the moment until we come up with something better. In your world, in your experience, what aims does that audience engagement and the strategy that you build around it do?
Yeah.
What are the aims when you do engage?
So again, at the risk of being boring, this comes back to our mission. And so the first goal that we have is to produce impactful public service journalism for New Yorkers. And that can mean real world policy outcomes or accountability outcomes. A law gets changed, someone is held legally or professionally accountable for wrongdoing, an issue is surfaced into the public discourse that hasn't been before, and a new kind of debate happens. Or, and this really goes to the service journalism, we actively help people and we're able to know whether we've actively helped them. They take some of the advice we've given about how to get things done and they put it to work in their lives. For example, we did a piece on how to get your criminal record sealed so that you can have less difficulty in renting an apartment. And a couple of people wrote to us to say that they were using our guide to navigate that process and find an apartment, and that they would keep us posted along the way. That's a concrete impact at the level of someone's day-to-day life. And also a more dispersed impact, we think, in terms of building trust. So, and I'm sure we'll circle back to some of these themes, but we think about engagement as, firstly, how can we produce better mission-related outcomes? Can we sharpen our choices editorially, report on things that really are affecting people's lives and matter to them? Because those are more likely to produce impact. Can we serve people with information about things that they actually want to know about and need to know about, which we may have completely not anticipated? Sometimes the collective intelligence of our newsroom means that we put something into the world that people hadn't been asking about, and it turns out to be helpful. But oftentimes we get really surprising questions or inputs from the community that we wouldn't have thought of, and we're able to produce more impactful work as a result. So that's the core of it. But then, of course, we also see very clearly that when we do work that's responsive in that way, and maybe that's another word for doing this, is thinking about forms of responsive journalism, we are able to create these more direct relationships with our readers. And so we see that to the extent that we are responsive, that journalism produces more conversions of different kinds. It's more likely that people sign up to our newsletter after reading pieces that come out of that work. It's more likely that they become members and support us financially. And we don't always get the most traffic to those stories in a kind of raw numbers sense, but oftentimes they have a long tail, they stick around, they're evergreen, and they have a kind of persistent value. So just to sum all of that up, we are trying to learn from our audience, learn from New York City communities, and produce journalism that's impactful. We are trying to build our relationship with those individuals and communities in a way that's durable. And we're trying to ensure that by doing those things, we build both relevance, reach, and revenue.
Wow. There is so much in what you've just said. Can I just first comment on how special that must have been when you get the feedback saying things like, you know, the criminal records piece that you just mentioned, how special that must be for the team to know that they've had an impact. That's amazing. And it sounds like a lot of these relationships that you're building are having an impact on your bottom line. And that's also really important. But it kind of gets me questioning like the whole measurement piece, because measuring impact is quite a difficult thing, or unless you found the perfect solution to that. And I'm very curious how you do it.
If I'd found the perfect solution, I'd probably go and become a consultant to funders or something. But no, I mean, we have a framework. And it mixes anecdote and data, which in our experience is what is the most realistic and helpful way to go about it. So we think about impact broadly in 3 buckets. One is real world change. So we reported on schemes used by predatory real estate speculators to fraudulently take control of properties owned by Black families in gentrifying neighborhoods and acquire them at a knockdown price and then resell them at an inflated price. And our coverage of that issue, which is very broadly discussed and a subject of immense pain and frustration in those neighborhoods. Investigatively, we figured out who the bad guys were who were doing it. And we did that in a lot of detail, with a lot of rigor, with a lot of input from both experts and readers. And that resulted in new laws, state level laws, to change the way in which inherited property is handled. So that's a very clear, if you like, a kind of clean shot of impact. Or we dug into all of the data on workplace injuries and cross-correlated it to heat. And we were able to see how much construction site injuries increase when it gets hotter. And New York had no state regulation around working in extreme temperatures. And after we put that reporting out, the state adopted guidelines for the first time. The governor mentioned it in her budget speech. And we try to design our work for impact. We try to think beforehand about where there are gaps and where we can make a difference. So that's impact prize number 1. You know, the second tier is really changing the conversation, affecting the ecosystem. So is our reporting being cited when policymakers are discussing changes or seeking accountability? For example, yesterday in the city council, there was a formal referral to city investigative bodies of the conduct of the New York City police in relation to Trump's immigration raids, and they cited our reporting. Now, there may or may not be any concrete impact, but there certainly was a kind of pretty high level conversation change, or are prominent people just talking about our work? Is our framing getting out there? So we try to track those kinds of events too. And, at a tier down from that, perhaps in terms of publicity, but really important to us is impact on individual people's lives, people telling us something made a difference. And then the third tier is there's a form of impact in what we do, which is just reaching people and getting the work out there, getting work that's actively designed to produce better outcomes circulated and read and shared. Because part of our impact is to make a richer, healthier civic conversation. So people need to be reading us for that. And there it's pretty straightforward kind of audience metrics. And of course we track, the more business side or revenue related conversions to newsletter readers and so on, but we don't categorize those as impact. Those live in a different bucket. So impact is more real world change, changing the conversation and the information ecosystem effects. And then finally, kind of building an audience community around what we do.
And do you have like a rating system in terms of? We
have played around with like trying to come up with scores and complicated spreadsheets and matrices, and we've essentially given up on that. We have a Slack channel which everyone contributes to, which pulls together concrete impacts and mentions of our work. We pull in, we monitor media mentions and appearances of our stories on a kind of big PR style media tracking platform. But no, we don't try to see whether our score has gone up or down, because it's mostly some kind of bro science to do that.
So I guess that all of your different articles must be so different. You can't really compare one piece to another.
No, I mean, what we do see, obviously it's the more investigative stories that are the most likely to produce policy and accountability changes. And service stories are more likely to produce impacts for individual people's lives. But it is also true that all of our service reporting is really reported. So we don't copy paste from the city's website that tells you how to get a permit for a block party, right? We go and report it out. And sometimes that has an accountability effect too, because there's often gaps between what the arrangement purports to be and what it really is.
When you're doing all of this, when you are engaging with the audience, when you're creating all of these investigations, what are the biggest hurdles or challenges in your experience, especially around engagement? What do you think is stopping you or even other news brands from engaging better?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for us and for many others. For us, I think in a number of newsrooms that I've worked in the course of my career, there have been both cultural challenges and kind of workflow and process challenges that make it harder to build a meaningful engagement practice, an engagement practice that goes beyond, well, we put something on social media and we, replied to some of the comments. And because workflows are so baked, and they may not be traditional print workflows anymore, they may now be digital workflows, but oftentimes those have become just as rigid and just as, in some ways, as print ones were. Like, well, okay, so now we include some top line analytics in our editorial conference, and we think about times of day when we publish, and we see that this category of stories drives more traffic or more subscriptions than the other, so let's do more of those. That kind of thing has generally been baked in, but baking into a news conference or a decision-making workflow, we received a lot of questions about trash collection or ranked choice voting or the weather. Today we got this question. That's really interesting. Who could work? What would be a way to follow up on it? Test the relevance of that question and bake that into your. Having someone in the newsroom who owns that and champions not the user in the kind of classical product sense necessarily, but the public, the reader, the community, and their perspective. I think that in a lot of newsrooms is tough. It's changing, but I don't think that digital transformation has been enough to really build meaningful, textured, thoughtful community listening and audience engagement into process. And I've seen editors and newsrooms grapple with that. For us, frankly, the biggest challenge is really resourcing it and making the decision that in a small newsroom that needs vastly more capacity to cover 8.5 million people in a city with a budget of $112 billion to build out enough specific engagement capacity to lead on it every day, but then also to mainstream those practices into the right areas of our reporting. So I gave you the example of the work we did around deed fraud and deed theft and inherited property. In that case, we got a bunch of tip-offs and followed up on the tip-offs with investigative reporting. And we put the community engagement at the end instead of at the beginning. Oftentimes we'll do it at the beginning. In this case, we did the research. We engaged with legislators. And once we had found out who the bad guys were and what they were doing and the laws changed. And then we had, actually just 2 weeks ago, we had an open newsroom kind of town hall session in one of the most affected neighborhoods where we brought together people who are really experts in dealing with these problems, who could offer resources to the community for responding if you feel like you're the target of this kind of practice. And then, of course, also hearing from people about what they were experiencing. And in that instance, hopefully we found some new readers and we built some trust in an audience and in a community that probably is not hugely engaged with what we do. And we will get some input for future stories. But we had initiated the theme on the basis of tip-offs. In other cases, we might hear from people, that their biggest concern right now is trying to figure out. During COVID, for example, a lot of people couldn't figure out unemployment insurance and other forms of cash assistance. And we created a product, a newsletter, a whole line of coverage to answer those questions. So it can kind of go both ways, but building out a team that is expert at managing those kinds of conversations, that has presence in the newsroom, spot those opportunities, whether the reporting starts with community input or starts from our own insight, and really allocating enough firepower to it. For us, that's really just a financial challenge, not a culture challenge anymore, because we've managed to inculcate in our team a real belief in this way of working.
The two-way, it's almost the human part of it, which we almost miss a little bit when we're in the digital world. It's like, how do we communicate with people when we are trying to engage and they're going through all of these issues? But how then do we do it at scale? I'm curious about the events bit. You mentioned, we went to an event. Or that always comes up as a really great form of engagement. I assume you do quite a lot of that.
Yeah.
Would you tell me a bit about it?
Yeah, we do a few different kinds of things. We have done things which are very open-ended. We like partner with a local library and some community organizations, and we'll go and have an off-the-record session conversation. People come along, they can talk about anything they want to. You try to have a facilitator who is good at eliciting input from people and being non-judgmental and ensuring a kind of rich conversation, and the journalists have to figure out how to hang back a little and let things emerge. Um,
The
so
challenge that
yeah,
it's a skill in itself, isn't it?
yeah, very much, and it goes to this whole kind of culture question of where do we fit in and how do we relate to people. So we've done some of those kinds of things with some success. I think we should do more, and in fact, given more resources, I think we would do more, and maybe even create some kind of. In the UK, MPs have surgeries where people can drop in. I'd love to think about a kind of newsroom surgery where you could go be in a place regularly and people could drop in. Then we do things that are more thematically targeted. So in the case of as property and deed fraud, we went to a neighborhood where it's rife. We brought in a couple of other nonprofit organizations that we respect that work in that space. We partnered with a bank that has a branch in that area and is concerned about people's demonstrating their commitment to securing Black generational wealth. And we had it was moderated by one of our people, but we didn't kind of own the panel. We just kind of inserted ourselves into it. We've done similar things around climate change and toxic Superfund site cleanup, where there's a bunch of community activism happening around what happens if you get flooding in this area that's completely saturated with noxious chemicals. How is the cleanup process going? How does climate affect that? In that case, again, we partnered it with people working on those issues, and we sent out targeted direct mail to the neighborhoods surrounding those sites, which would introduce people to some of our existing coverage and then invite them to join us in a discussion. Yeah, they can be more open-ended or they can be more thematic. Of course, we also do ones that are, join us on a Zoom.
Yep.
Yeah, which work very well, which can work very, very well. I mean, when Donald Trump torpedoed the criminal trial of New York City's mayor, Eric Adams, we had been very much in the forefront of covering the corruption allegations against the mayor. And so we sent out a kind of flash alert for a Zoom call on that issue. I think about 1,200 people RSVP'd. We had about 1,000 in total
Wow.
attend that event.
It's nice to know that Zoom can deal with the influx of people as well.
We had to upgrade our license a couple of times because but then we are able to also gather some email addresses, ping people afterwards and say, thanks for coming, here's some more work by us, subscribe to our newsletter, that kind of thing. So yeah, pretty across the board.
It sounds like you have loads of really great strategies that you use to engage people effectively. Which do you think has been the most effective? Or do you have others that you use that are maybe even more effective? I don't know.
I mean, I don't know if there's one that's the most effective. It depends a little bit on the topic and what you're trying to achieve. Certainly one thing that is effective is finding proxies or allies or other people whom you can work with who might have a different kind of relationship with communities and individuals than a news organization is able to. This can be a bit uncomfortable for journalists, like, are these advocacy organizations or not? How do you think about their reputation, their perspective relative to yours? That can all be scary, but it's totally navigable and manageable if you're thoughtful about it. So finding the right third-party groups to work with, partnering, using a place like a library, which is a real community convening place, highly trusted, thoughtful staff, often who know the neighborhood very well. But then also other kinds of community groups to get people there, to build trust, to manage the conversation in a slightly different way. I felt when I stood up at our event in Bedford-Stuyvesant on deed theft, I was like, listen, like some journalist is not going to show up here and tell you people what the problem is. You know what the problem is. What we can do is bring some people who have some ideas about solutions and some access to powerful policymakers. And so having other organizations there that is not our team showing up and telling people that we know their lives better than they do. So that set of strategies, organizing strategies essentially.
Such a great way
can be very valuable.
Build authenticity as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely. People, especially if people don't know you, but they do know the group that organizes whatever it is, the food bank. And so if they can make an introduction to you and broker an introduction to you, you're borrowing a little bit from their trust capital. And then, of course, you have to earn your own, but you've got your foot in the door.
Yeah. And that's sometimes the hardest part, isn't it? Especially when audiences in general have this, not all, but there's a big preconception of news and fake news. And there's so much going on in the world and maybe less so in local. I'd almost argue.
Yeah, no, less so in local, but more, I would say differently textured in local, because it's certainly the case that the current sort of dynamics around information disorder, misinformation, fake news, all of those kinds of things are an overlay. But there is a really complicated history of the relationship between communities in deeply inequitable, racially, economically inequitable cities and their local news organizations. On the one hand, there can be a lot of familiarity and higher trust than there is with national news outlets. But there's also a history of local news organizations that really serve local power and more than they serve local people. And there's a lot of ambivalence and complexity around that. Or in, a deeply racially and economically diverse and inequitable city like New York, of local news organizations that are predominantly white, certainly English speaking, and more aligned with the permanent governing class than they are with people. So, those are real issues, and how you show up and who shows up with you really can matter to address some trust deficits that way predate social media or AI mediated video. Yeah, so those techniques work well. We've had some success with using targeted direct mail, introducing new people to us. So we'll send a postcard with a QR code linking to a story, and we'll try to do that in a way that is data informed. So we did some service journalism, for example, on the laws that regulate how warm your landlord has to keep your apartment. They have to be at least 64 degrees Fahrenheit. So we looked up in the city's open data portal the buildings associated with the most complaints around heat, and we sent direct mail just to those buildings. And we heard back from people.
Who doesn't love some snail mail?
Yeah, exactly. A nice, pretty postcard, a QR code. We had about a 7% click-through rate on those QR codes, which is shockingly high. Wow. People wrote back to us and said, "This is my experience. This is how your story helped me," or "This is the thing you should look into." So that's, it's relatively expensive, and we don't have the resources to do that at vast scale, but it can work pretty well. And then very simple things work for us. Call outs like, what questions have you got about the election? Literally. And then answering those questions and shouting out the readers who asked them in the coverage. So Melinda asked us X, and here's the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are people interacting directly with you? So you've mentioned the postcards and a QR code. How are your editorial teams receiving that? What forms is this taking?
They use different kinds of intake. Email, text messaging, Google Forms, all kinds of pretty simple hack together things, nothing fancy. We tried building a kind of chatbot intake system, but it was really bad and we gave up on it.
Why? Why so?
Part of it was you could ask us a question and it would search our corpus of service journalism and give you an answer. This is probably something that will improve quite quickly, but at the state of the art 6 months ago when we were doing it, it just hallucinated way too much and was very damaging. And then we wanted to kind of build a chat workflow for query intake, but we didn't really feel like it added that much value relative to, do something familiar like send us a text, which is already a normal behavior that people have. So we just defaulted to the simpler format. We share offices with and often partner with a really interesting news organization called Documented, which covers immigration and immigrant communities. And they have an incredible set of WhatsApp communities. And they actually have reporters assigned to large WhatsApp groups whose job it is to answer questions on those WhatsApp groups and complete the whole life cycle within the WhatsApp group or the WeChat group for their Chinese.
Wow.
For the Chinese community thing, which is pretty amazing. But we haven't gone nearly as far as they have.
That must take a lot of resource. Quite hard to scale, I assume.
Yeah. No, so, one reporter is looking after a group with 7,500 people in it.
Yeah. They probably know a few of them by name at some point.
They do, and they've built incredible levels of trust and direct relationships with people through it.
Have you ever had any audience engagement that's genuinely surprised you, where you really weren't expecting your audience to react in the way they did, or Any moments like that?
I mean, I think the thing that surprises or thrills us the most is when people come back to us and say that something helped.
Mm.
And that happens a lot. Like, I'm not going to say every day, but very often people will write us and tell us that the journalism worked for them, and then tell us some more. And there are lots of the woman who wrote to us about her years-long struggle to get her landlord to turn on the heat, and the resolution that she got through our story. So that's what we hope for, but it certainly surprises us when it has such a one-to-one relationship between what we do
Do you share that kind
and
of
the
thing back
outcome.
out?
We do. We
Yeah.
do, if the person is happy for us to. Yeah, and I think it's really good when you can close the loop and show the ways in which community questions inform what we do. I'm not sure if there are like single point shocking findings, but I've been surprised sometimes by how richly you can combine investigative reporting and engagement, actually. But starting by building trust. COVID examples are unfashionable, but we had an amazing community collaborative journalism project during COVID called Missing Them, which sprung out of some data work that our newsroom did, and saw that pretty much all of the obituaries that were getting published in the mainstream media were for white, wealthy New Yorkers, and the vast poorer communities of color were vastly more affected and were dying at vastly higher deaths were at vastly higher rates in those communities. So we created a project to give everyone an obituary, and we staffed it with volunteer retired journalists, journalism students, and you could send in your loved ones obituary and we would gussy it up and give it a permanent home online. And then we created initially Zoom-based virtual memorial services in which people could share their stories. A community theater group made a play based on these testimonies, and we started to have some in-person events. The mayor projected a whole lot of the photographs that we'd gathered onto the Brooklyn Bridge, and a radio show read out all the names we'd gathered over the course of an hour. I had listeners to the radio show read them out. And that built incredible depth of trust with people at a very low trust time. And so we started to hear from people, well, my uncle was in a veterans home upstate, and he was given this experimental treatment without proper authorization and he died. Or you are looking at death counts in the prisons, and the data is telling you this, but I can tell you that my relative was not reflected. And so then the base of the network of relationships we had built through the obituary project advanced our investigative reporting.
Wow. It's impressive how, well, first of all, I don't think we should avoid COVID examples because it was such a big moment for everybody in everyone's lives. So they are totally relevant. It wasn't that long ago, really. There was before COVID and after COVID. It's a whole thing. But I think for me, what I'm hearing, and a lot of it is that trust isn't that you need to prove that you're doing stuff that's worth people's trust, but trust actually is an extremely emotional thing as well. And I think especially when we're looking at like investigative journalism, sometimes we don't take into consideration that emotion, but it sounds like what you were doing was actually, it was the emotion that built those relationships more than anything.
Yeah, absolutely. And the sense that I can go to you with my story and I'm going to be safe to do that. And that doesn't just mean safe in terms of the classical source protection argument, but safe in terms of like emotionally safe, like you're going to take care of my story, which, and I agree. I think that some of the COVID examples are very important, and it makes me crazy that we're kind of memory holing it, because oftentimes what we have to do as journalists is deal with people in the worst moments of their lives. And this was an enormously concentrated worst moment of life for all of us. And I think there are real lessons in it that we shouldn't forget about.
That, and we managed to do some of our best work during that time.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Actually, we forget some of the things that we did so well then that could actually be recreated now in so much of our reporting. And I think it's a shame that we don't really take the learnings from that moment and bring them on because we're saying, oh, that was a COVID thing. It was another time.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah.
Maybe we could talk a tiny bit about tech. Obviously, AI is always a thing. Being a small newsroom, really focusing on impact. Where do you see things like AI, data analytics, everything that you're doing in terms of audience engagement? Where do you see that going, and what role does it play in your newsroom?
Yeah,
I'll
say two things. I mean, one thing is that this kind of audience engagement that we're discussing, I think, is our strongest moat against being disintermediated out of the picture by AI. And it's going to be the thing that enables us to sustain meaningful audience relationships during a period where everyone is in AI mode. it's only through relationships that we're going to be able to have people have a habit, whether that habit is opening our email in the morning or coming to our homepage or engaging with us on social media or at an event. So the first thing is, what about this is enabling us to defend against meaningful risks to what we do from AI? Because AI does, AI at the content, at the level of search, at the level of aggregation, does threaten to interrupt our ability to build community around what we do and achieve impact.
Yeah.
Thinking about it in mission-driven terms. On the other hand, of course, there are powerful enablement things that we can use AI to do. So we've tried bringing, automating some audience engagement, and so far it has not gone well. And actually, I'm sort of suspicious of the whole notion of it. Perhaps I think there are reasons to think about the journalists also have to be accountable, and the dimension of human to human engagement has some real value. It doesn't scale, obviously, but I think it has some real value, and we have to preserve it. So I think it's still possible that automating some kind of initial contact management or chat or engagement might still be something that works for us, but in the short term, that's not going to be where the action is. We of course look at data in an old school non-AI way carefully to see which stories are performing and whether stories that have a higher component of engagement are driving better mission related outcomes, whether it's impact or conversions. So we do that, but that's nothing very fancy. That's looking at pretty classic audience analytics. We use AI tools more for analyzing large data sets, extracting insights from them, and also extracting insights about our own work. So for example, we make a claim that we reach the parts of New York that other news organizations don't, but we have never tagged our stories well enough to know whether that's the case. So we used a ChatGPT to analyze our entire corpus and locate all of our stories and build us a map of all our coverage and tell us whether we were in fact showing up in all those neighborhoods that we claim to show up. And we do by and large, but it also shows some gaps. So that can be kind of both validating and correcting kind of guidance. So we're doing those kinds of things, but we're not inserting much AI between ourselves and the people we serve yet, and I'm not sure how we will, when we will. So mainly about efficiency and enablement rather than scaling person to person interaction.
And what about pitfalls or challenges when it comes to your audience engagement initiatives?
I think the philosophically most complicated one for us is that part of our audience engagement is about the mission-driven part of audience engagement for us is really addressing the needs of people who are not well served by the news media. Whether that's in terms of policy outcomes or just in terms of reaching those people and building trust in those communities. But the revenue piece, of course, is about activating people who tend to be more affluent and who are super served. And there is a risk that if we index purely on the things that excite people who move all the way down the funnel to the point where they make us a gift, that we lose sight of the other core aspects of our mission. And this is kind of a slightly nuanced and complicated thing. People in the neighborhoods that have the highest propensity to vote, that have the highest media consumption, that are most switched on about the news, oftentimes that will feel very mission driven because they're going to be excited by our investigative reporting or the political insights that we provide. And they may feel motivated to give off the back of that. And we'll look at it and go, great, we did a story about the mayor being terrible and someone gave us $10. But a person 3 blocks over on in the public housing project may also care about the mayor, but their big focus might be what's happening to nutritional assistance benefits under the Trump administration. Where can they get them now? And that reader is not going to give us $10. Yeah. So thinking about what we measure, thinking about whom we serve, thinking about which dimensions of engagement we prioritize, we have to be very conscious of living in these kind of different worlds of incentive all the time.
You must be having some very interesting conversations in the newsroom every day to be able to reach that balance.
Yeah, very much so.
Thinking of, I think, 2 bits. Thinking of the future of audience engagement. Obviously, it's quite hard, especially when everything's changing so quickly. Where do you see it going in the next 3, 5 years?
Yeah, I think that the more or less complete breakdown of the scale play is pretty much upon us. And so I think that the idea of using the tools that we generally group together under audience engagement to build trusted one-to-one relationships is going to bring this stuff into the core of the business. And it's going to be much less about big time clickstream data and much more about what enables us to connect one-to-one with our audiences and build community around what we do.
And in terms of your team in this world, what skills do they need? What are you seeing from your team in terms of, you're doing so much engagement in your newsroom. Are you training them specially for this, or what do you expect from them?
Yeah, I mean, the public journalism school in New York City actually has a great audience engagement program. So we have brought people out of that. It's the graduate school, Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. So we have brought people through from that program who bring a lot of great skills with them. In some senses, this is as much about attitude as about skills. It's about the posture that you assume relative to your audience. What kind of humility is there in that posture? What clarity is there in that posture about what your role as a journalist is and how you are able to relate to people? I think that's a harder thing to train, but not impossible. And the people in our newsroom who lead this work have an attitude of incredible respect and affection for our audience. And they're excited to hear from them. And they are thrilled by the fact that these people care about our work. So showing up with that posture and that attitude is the thing that makes them successful. Rachel Holiday Smith, our managing editor who leads all of our explanatory and service journalism, just exemplifies that every day. It's how, if you look at her social media feeds, if you look at how she shows up in the newsroom, if you look at the tone of the coverage that she produces and the way she interacts with people, that just manifests itself all the time and infuses itself through our culture. Of course, you have to be able to, facilitate a conversation thoughtfully, and you have to be able to look at some numbers and understand what they mean. Those are things that can be trained. But the core is, what do you come to this work with, and why do you do it?
They need to believe in the mission,
Yeah,
definitely.
they need to believe in the mission, and they need to believe in the public whom we serve, not as an abstraction, but as as humans who want to be good, and to kind of let that shine through and show up in what we do as well.
Love that. What impact has your audience engagement had on your organization's bottom line? Obviously non-profit, but still bottom line and loyalty.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that the work we do that drives people to sign up for our newsletter, ultimately to make donations, is our really robust accountability reporting, high quality investigative journalism, and service journalism that principally grows out of engagement-based strategies. So it has certainly helped to grow our newsletter list and to grow which is about 30% larger now than it was a year ago, and grew a good 20% the year before that, but got its initial lift because our COVID-based work was so community-oriented and so engagement-oriented. And the same goes for our list of contributors, which has grown, financial contributors, which has grown at a similar rate.
Congratulations.
And I mean, it's still only 10 or 12% of our revenue, but it's really important.
Of course.
So we can see that from a conversion, this work drives a significant proportion of our conversions, and then it has a kind of a ratchet or knock-on effect, because larger institutional funders who care about our mission, they see it as very validating when people are prepared to come to a meeting and sit with us, or prepared to make a small financial contribution. So the impact the financial impact is larger than the scale of any like one-off contributions that we get.
Fantastic. And one last question for you. Do you have an engagement hack for me by any chance? Something that you would offer either someone going into their engagement journey for the first time, or even to a news brand that might have been working for years and actually are just trying to focus on this? Is there something that you would suggest?
I think what I'll repeat and double down on the idea of finding great partners. And this applies to partner organizations and individuals in communities. It applies to partner creators and people on social media whom you can work with, and people who are trusted proxies that can take your conversation and your engagement into a different place than you're able to do on your own.
Well, that's the first one for me, and I really like that one. So definitely a great hack. Thank you so much, Nic. This was so great. And oh my gosh, the amount of examples of stuff that you're doing around engagement is just mind-blowing, and I love it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.